Now that the Rings of Power is out and can be seen for the mess that it is, all the Wakandans are tripping over themselves to find a new narrative since their last ones all failed. First, they claimed critics hated women because they didn't like benighted Galadriel, but that failed because the actual criticism is that this goes against Galadriel's established character. So, like typical ideologues, the Wakandans scoured the internet for some random out-of-context line they could use to justify the change, found one, and then quickly dropped it when everyone pointed out that by the time frame of the show, Galadriel had changed. Then they claimed the critics didn't want minorities in their fantasy stories, but that failed when everyone pointed out that Arda is full of non-white people. They're just not from Middle-earth or Numenor, two cultures based on Western Europe, so it's not realistic for them to be multiracial. So the Wakandans shifted gears, claiming that it was ridiculous for people to want realism in fantasy stories, saying, "You can believe there are dragons but not black people?" But that failed when the Wakandans justified the change by saying, wait for it, "It's not realistic to not have black people in the story because there are black people in the real world." They've jumped from hand-waving the idea of respecting the source material to claiming people fear change to claiming people just hate Amazon. They finally landed on, the show isn't even out yet. But now that it is and has been received, and I'll be generous, mixed reviews, the Wakandans are out of narratives. Now they're claiming there's review bombing, and I'm sure some of that is happening, but the general response from the audience, both Tolkien fans and normies, is that the show is mediocre and doesn't live up to the hype or expectations. Now, that doesn't mean you can't like the show. You are welcome to like bad things, but you can't pretend that they're not bad. My favorite Matrix film is The Matrix Reloaded. I love that movie. I saw that movie 7 times in theaters, more than any other film, but the movie has problems. The bad VFX, too much exposition, the rave scene, Keanu Reeves' ass. Love the film, it still has problems. And so does the show. The second episode reveals so many new issues, but the worst one is that the show banks on you knowing the lore. I figured the showrunners would dance around the rights issue by mentioning things hinted at in the appendices and then just adding in the real story. But most of these moments are references to events, people, or objects that aren't in the show, but the scenes hinge on you knowing what they're talking about. It's a bizarre thing to do, especially since several of the events are loosely based, at best, on something Tolkien wrote. So not only is there no in-show reference to the event, but it's half-assed fan service. I rewatched the episode, and in my mind all I heard was Ricky Gervais laughing the whole time, because it's so bad. We finally get the title opening for the show. It's this rearranging of stones into different shapes and symbols. I can see what they were going for, and while it isn't anywhere near as epic the opening the showrunners wanted, it isn't bad either. It looks like this may be some practical effects with some CG added in to nuance it. It's okay. No one's gonna try to copy this or talk about it like they did the Game of Thrones opening. It's just okay. Now, I'm showing this frame just to highlight that they claim the show is based on the Lord of the Rings and the appendices. I would have accepted lightly inspired by, but not based. Based requires something from the books to be in the show, and that barely happens. There's some locations and some names, and that's about it. Everything else is made up, like fake Galadriel, aka Strong Woman, just floating in the sea. In the previous episode, she jumped off the boat heading to Amon, and real quick, I want to correct something I said in the previous video. I said that it wasn't clear when the Valar lifted the band on the Noldor, however that's not entirely true. In the Peoples of Middle-earth, Tolkien suggests that the band was lifted at the end of the first stage, but that isn't in the Silmarillion, which is technically the official tale, so it's up for grabs whether it counts. Anyway, Strong Woman is just floating in the middle of the sea. How in the world does she plan to swim the whole way? I'm trying to figure out the logic of having this moment because it doesn't make any sense that the elves, or the Valar, the gods for that matter, would leave her stranded in the sea. Y'all know she bailed. She's technically allowed into Amon. Y'all won't send her a boat? But see, I'm thinking about things, and that's where I get into trouble. Speaking of trouble, little hobbit Nori finds a man in the middle of this meteor crater. Her friend shows up and tries to talk Nori from going down into the crater, but that doesn't work. She trips down into the crater, and it turns out the crater isn't even hot, despite it being all flame, which is kind of, you know what, whatever, I don't care. I genuinely don't care. Fire everywhere, doesn't burn, fine. She goes up to this dude who wakes up, grabs her, and starts spazzing out, causing the fire, which isn't at all dangerous, to grow until he passes out again. The fire takes the shape of a great eye, and I'm torn between thinking this is Sauron or one of the wizards. It's obviously meant to look like Sauron, but why would he travel in a meteor when he's already in Middle-earth? That doesn't make any sense, but then that's kind of the theme of the show, so I wouldn't put it past the showrunners to do this. However, if it is one of the Istari, who shouldn't arrive until the Third Age, the question is which one? Is it Gandalf, Saruman, Radagast, or one of the Blue Wizards? I don't know, and this episode is hell-bent on making sure no one does. Nori convinces her friend to help her hide Meteor Man until the morning, while the hobbits plan on migrating to get away from whatever ill news those hunters from the previous episode may portend. Meanwhile, Lenny Henry continues to imagine what it'd be like if Cliff Huxtable were a hobbit. I'd actually give him credit if he wore one of those Cosby sweaters. I love how the showrunners were so keen on having a diverse cast and yet fell right into black stereotypes. If I told you they stole this scene from 227, could you even tell the difference? Anyway, Nori and her friend take the man to some tree and hide him for the night, and Nori waxes poetically about being meant to find this man, which again makes me think this might be Gandalf. Never mind that he and the other wizards arrive in Middle-earth via the Grey Havens 4,000 years from now in the Third Age. Just throw him in anyway. Then it cuts to Arondir and Bronwyn searching through Bronwyn's hometown. It's been destroyed and it's not clear by what. The pair find a hole in the floor of one of the homes, and Arondir decides to go down to take a look. This is supposed to be some touching moment between the two as Arondir faces the unknown, but it doesn't work because we don't have any connection to Arondir or Bronwyn and don't know anything about Bronwyn's people or their interactions with the elves. All of the factors leading to the tension in the scene are absent from the show, so it just falls flat. At any rate, Bronwyn runs back to the previous town to warn the others about the hole. Then we get generic Elven City number 3. And do we get to see the streets of the city or the buildings? No. We cut right to Celebrimbor's room, where Elrond sees Feanor's hammer, the one that forged the Silmarils, and Celebrimbor tells a story about Morgoth staring at the stolen jewels until he cried from their beauty, only breaking his gaze when his tears fell on the jewels, revealing the evilness of his reflection. That's interesting because Morgoth is said to have set the Silmarils into an iron crown, which he never took off his head. I guess his tears just curved like the bullet that killed JFK. But let's set that aside and let me ask you 2 questions. And here's the rule. You can only use what's in the show to answer them. My questions. Who is Feanor and what are the Silmarils? Oh, you might know the answer, but where in the show are they mentioned? They weren't mentioned in the prologue. Everything about Feanor and the Silmarils was cut out. Neither were mentioned in any detail in the first episode. So who is Feanor? Why does Elrond say Feanor's hammer created so much beauty and pain? What are the Silmarils? Why does Morgoth have them? Actually, I have a better question. Who is Morgoth? We're told he destroyed the 2 trees, but nothing else. This entire moment hinges on you having read the appendices at least and the Silmarillion at best. If you didn't do that, none of this makes a lick of sense. That is terrible writing. And it's embarrassing that no one caught this and changed the prologue or threw in some extra lines of dialogue to make this work. That's why it's getting bad reviews, people. Anyway, Celebrimbor wants to build a tower that can house the hottest fire ever so he can make wonders, but the elves are somehow lacking in manpower, so Gil-galad sends Elrond instead, presumably because Elrond knows Durin, a dwarf prince, that can get the dwarfs to help Celebrimbor. This is a shift from what happens in the books, where such is Celebrimbor's renown as a craftsman that it gets the dwarves' attention, and they form an alliance with him and other elfsmiths. Now, you might ask why the showrunners would change that when it doesn't make any sense. Well, there are a couple of reasons. One, in the books, Celebrimbor is Lord of Ost-in-Adil, a city founded by Galadriel and Celeborn. And since the showrunners turned Galadriel into a strong woman who don't need no man, there is no Celeborn. So she founded no cities because she was off playing Kill Bill. 2, they needed some faux conflict, so they decided to have Durin bar Elrond from entering Khazad-dûm because Elrond is a bad best friend. I wish I was joking, but I'm not. This is the actual plot. Elrond takes Celebrimbor to meet with Durin, but the doorman denies him entry. Elrond then invokes the right of Sigyn Turag. There is no such thing. Sigyn Turag translates into Longbeards. It has nothing to do with a rite or ritual, it's just a name. You might be wondering why the showrunners would make up some dwarven ritual. Just wait. We gotta pre-cringe before we get into it, or you might hurt something. This invocation gets the dwarves to let Elrond into Khazad-dûm, and for the first time we get to see Dwarvelf in its full glory, and it's shockingly underwhelming. I might as well be looking at a matte painting for Star Trek. In fact, I think this is a matte painting. Imagine spending $250 million on a TV show, making it the most expensive show ever made, and using matte paintings. I mean, they're well done. They look awesome, but it does nothing for me. And I'm amazed by that. I'm genuinely amazed that an infinite chasm of gray columns shrouded in darkness was more awe-inspiring than this $5 million shot. You got trounced by nothingness. All I can do is laugh, cause damn. Now, let me explain why this is the case though. The reason this moment in Fellowship hits so hard is because we spent so much time with the Fellowship looking for Moria. When we finally get to see it, you start to imagine what it could have looked like in its full might, and the music just solidifies that. In the Rings of Power, there is no build up to the moment. Hell, there's no showcasing of any of the cities. So when you see it, it's like, oh, Elrond's shocked, but okay. The music is trying so hard to hit that emotional beat, but since there was no build up, and this fucking spotlight is in the goddamn way, it just isn't awe-inspiring. The designs look fantastic. It looks like they kept the square edge design from the films despite that not being in the books, but it doesn't hit. Speaking of hitting, now we come to the rite of Sigyn Tara. We get to see Durin and the multi-ethnic dwarves who now look like tiny Vikings complete with boob armor, thereby managing to piss off everyone. You remember when you saw the dwarves in The Hobbit? Dude with the starfish afro? Yeah, you missed that shit now, don't you? You thought it couldn't get worse. Well, you were wrong. So why are these fools here? Well, they're gonna have a rock off. You heard that right. They're gonna break rocks with hammers until one of them can't swing it anymore. And if Elrond wins, Durin will listen to him. But if he loses, Elrond is banned forever. Like I said in my last video, everyone who dissed the Hobbit films owes Peter Jackson an apology. I'm sorry, Sir Peter. I did not know. But now I have seen. It can be so much worse. It's not just that this entire thing is silly, contrived, and ultimately pointless. It's also that it tonally doesn't match the rest of the show. Nothing else is this silly, not even Lenny Henry, although he is trying. In just 2 scenes, we're going to watch someone ruthlessly kill his own shipmates, and then the immediate scene following it is the end of this ridiculous game. Feels like it's 2 different shows edited together, or some weird crossover like Power Rangers and TJ Hooker. Even Tolkien understood that he had to tone down the whimsy at a certain point because it takes away from the seriousness of the story. You're adding it in where it never was. Why? Anyway, it cuts back to Nori and Meteor Man. He's scribbling something on rocks, and when Nori tries to speak to him, he screams and the weather changes, the skies darken, and they're really playing into this Gandalf angle. Nori gets him to calm down and tries to teach him her name, but he doesn't understand even though he appears to be able to write and or draw. He starts drawing on the ground, not to communicate, but what appears to be random marks, and this is intercut with Nori's father trying to set up a tent for some feast. The log is too heavy for the man, and he starts to lose control. Meanwhile, Meteor Man draws more furiously, and as he snaps his stick, Nori's dad twists his ankle. The way it's cut makes it seem like these 2 events are connected, like Meteor Man caused the ankle twist, but I don't think that's actually what happens. I think it's just incidental, which makes the editing choice weird. Meteor Man starts shouting words at Nori, but I couldn't figure out what language it was he was speaking. As this happens, Nori's friend comes up to tell her about her father's injury. Back at the camp, she sees how badly her father was hurt, and feels bad because she wasn't there to help, as if her 95 pounds would have made a difference. With her father injured, there's no way he can migrate, unless someone were to put him in a cart or carry him, and I'm sure they don't have any means of doing. Oh, I guess y'all just forgot about it that quick, huh? Speaking of forgetting, Strong Woman is still swimming back to Middle-earth. She bumps into a group of shipwreck survivors, which includes Discount Aragorn, who were attacked by a sea worm. The Black Woman helps Strong Woman onto the raft, but for no particular reason, the others are hostile to Strong Woman, refusing to share water with her or tell her where they're from. Eventually, they discover she's an elf, and the Black Woman accuses Strong Woman of being a liar because. I'm struggling to figure out why. They asked how Strong Woman ended up in the middle of nowhere. She says she was separated from her ship, which is technically true. So how is she a liar? Well, see, the showrunners want conflict, but they don't want to earn it. So instead of giving some reason for these people to distrust elves or have Strong Woman actually lie, they just have the people turn on her as the sea worm appears. It goes under the ship, and the Black Woman blames Strong Woman for leading it there after it already destroyed their ship, so it's possibly just still hunting them, and shoves her off the raft. Meanwhile, Discount Aragorn unties the part of the raft he's on, leaving his shipmates to be eaten by the worm. Nice introduction to one of the show's protagonists. Nothing says love this character like watching him murder his own shipmates. Then, after doing that, he rows back to help Strong Woman, for no reason. He kills people he seemingly knows, but helps a stranger? What? Now, the rumor is that this dude is actually Sauron, which would at least explain his behavior. However, if he is Sauron, the showrunners have thoroughly broken the lore because Galadriel knew Anatar, the fair form Sauron took to seduce men and elves, was no good the moment she was aware of him. So if this is Sauron, the showrunners have not only turned Galadriel into She-Ra, but they've stripped her of one of her most defining features, her wisdom. Tolkien isn't rolling in his grave, he's begging for his remains to be cremated so when the second coming happens he won't have a body to be able to see this shit. Speaking of shit, the rock splitting ends with Elrond breaking his hammer and not being able to lift another. He gets banished, and on the elevator ride back to the surface, we find out why. See, it's been 20 years since Elrond visited his dear friend Durin. 20 years is nothing to an elf, but a life to a dwarf, who lived to be 250 years old. So when your bestie misses a tenth of your life, you pitch a hissy fit. Durin's butthurt that Elrond missed his wedding and the birth of his children. How could his friend, who lives half a continent away, have missed such important events? If only there were a way that Elrond could have known, say by Durin sending a wedding invite, or a letter telling his friend his wife is pregnant and ready to pop. The whole scene plays out as if Elrond should have known or dropped by sooner, but there's no mention of Durin doing anything to contact Elrond. If you want to talk to someone and they're not contacting you, wouldn't you contact them? Apparently not. Durin, Prince of Khazad-dûm, made no effort to contact his bestie. Did no one read this out loud? No one. It's impossible. Everybody does table reads. There's no way they read this out loud and it didn't occur to a single soul that Elrond couldn't know these things were happening unless someone told him. It'd be different if they wrote into this that he had gotten an invite but ignored it, but they didn't do that. So it makes it sound like Durin just expected Elrond to randomly show up on his wedding day. No one caught this glaring problem as big as Durin's wife, Queen Doritos. $250 million, no one caught it. So then Elrond, ever the politician, apologizes, which gets Durin to take him to see his wife and kids in his completely empty house. Yes, dwarves hoard gold and jewels, but furniture? Nah. And yes, Queen Doritos is inexplicably black, even though the dwarves live underground and there would be no reason for them to ever develop dark skin, and we only see a few other non-white dwarves, making this blatant tokenism all the more obvious. Yes, you're fixing Tolkien's whiteness problem by having 5 black people on the show. Now it's balanced. I can finally love Middle-earth now that you have 5 people who look like me, including Queen Delaris. Now the actress is fine. She's clearly enjoying herself, even though the script she's been given is a mess. Just like the last episode, instead of moving past Durin being pissy with Elrond, it goes on and on for nearly 10 minutes. We got it, he's mad, move on. We get some silly bit about Queen Doritos singing to the rocks to find the good ones, and Durin finally agreeing to hear Elrond's proposal. There's also this throwaway bit about this tree being the seedling of another particular tree, and I'm not even going to name it because if you haven't read the books, you wouldn't even know what I was talking about. This moment requires you to have read the books or seen The Lord of the Rings. It doesn't work any other way. Then it cuts back to Strong Woman and Discount Aragorn who start a pissing match over who can be the moodiest bitch. You don't know pain. No, you don't know my pain. Well, you don't know my pain. I know something of your pain. Who wrote this? Who did this? Who are you? Jennifer Hutchinson. Why? What were you trying to do? Because whatever it was, it failed. These two people are totally unlikable. Strong Woman is so focused on revenge that she doesn't care about anybody else, and Discount Aragorn just murdered some people. These are the two characters we're supposed to root for, and they're horrible people. Why did you write them like this? Are you going to try to redeem them? Well, good luck. Trying to redeem them is going to be a pain in the ass, and so far it looks like nobody working on this show is up to the task. This was a bad decision. But at least their bickering stops when they face a coming storm. The show finally gets back to Bronwyn, who goes to warn the town of the hole in the ground and some impending threat, but they don't believe her because she was making bedroom eyes with the elf. This scene probably would have worked better if there was some backstory, some tangible, plausible reason for them not liking the elves, but there isn't. Meanwhile, back at her home, Bronwyn's son complains about the rats under the floorboard, only to find out those aren't rats. At the same time, Arondir discovers things moving in the tunnels, and he tries to escape and winds up getting captured. Bronwyn goes home and sees that the place is ransacked and now sports a hole in the floor. She checks the hole for her son, but he's actually hiding in a cubbyhole in the wall. He tells her to run away to get help, but instead she hides in the cupboard as we get our first look at an orc. And it's alright. It's not the greatest thing ever, or the worst, which is a running theme of the show. It's just alright. Anyway, these two get manhandled a bit, throwing everything they can at the orc and just having little effect. That makes sense. The orcs are supposed to be unusually strong, so the idea that they can take getting stabbed in the back, run through with the side, then strangled and still be fine totally works. Bronwyn eventually beheads the orc and then takes it to the tavern and tells everyone to prepare to leave for the Elven Watchtower if they want to live. Back in the storm, Strong Woman ties herself to the raft and apparently to the spool that also holds the rope, and tries to act all manly, telling Discount Aragorn to take her hand, only for the spool to fall into the water and drag Strong Woman down to the bottom of the sea. Discount Aragorn magically grows a conscience and decides to save Strong Woman because he uses her knife to cut her free. They surface and climb onto what's left of the raft. Back with Nori, Meteor Man looks up at the stars. Nori and her friend approach with lanterns filled with fireflies. Meteor Man does some woo on the friend's lantern, freeing the fireflies, and then he speaks to them Gandalf style, getting them to hover in the air to cover certain stars. Nori reads this as Meteor Man trying to find certain constellations. She doesn't know those constellations, but she figures Lynn and Henry might. However, as she realizes this, the fireflies all die. Because. Why even pretend to give reason for things? Just let shit happen. Another theme of the show. Meanwhile, back in Khazad-dûm, Durin meets with his father, who agrees to help Celebrimbor. The pair walk into a room with a small chest on the table. The father opens the box and there's a shimmering glow coming from it. Since the Great Rings haven't been created and the Arkenstone hasn't been found, there are only a few things this could be. Either a Silmaril, which would be blasphemy, the Noglamir, the necklace that once held a Silmaril, the original Elisar taken by Erendil to Aman and returned to Middle-earth by Gandalf, a Palantir, a Seeing Stone, or Nymphalos, which was a large pearl Thingol gave to the dwarves. Or it could be some shit these people made up, since they're so happy to do that. It better not be a Silmaril, though. Seriously. Anyway, Bronwyn's son packs up for the escape and decides to take along the broken sword he stole in the previous episode, which begins to draw blood from his wounded arm to repair itself. As you do. The episode ends with Strong Woman and Discount Aragorn being spotted by a Númenórean ship. It's weird though that there's been no mention of them up to this point, even though they are a massive powerhouse and dominated Middle-earth during the Second Age. The third episode looks like it's going to focus on Númenor, so now we're going to see how talented or not talented the showrunners and writers are, because they have nothing from the books to work with. They're going to have to make it all up, and it's got to be really good for it to work. Judging from the stuff I know they've added in, I suggest setting your expectations very low, like to the ground. That way it can only get better. But what do I know? I'm just some guy.